Kia ora.
Kia ora.
My name's Gareth,
And I'm Roger.
and together we're
Roger and Gareth.
welcome along to this Rainbow LGBTI Rainbow walk tour. It's great to have you with us on this wonderful day here in Wellington, New Zealand. Today we're going to be doing the Red Walk tour, which is kind of inner city Wellington around Vivian Street, Upper Cube Street. Yeah, there are a couple of stories that are dealing with hate crimes, and so they're quite hard to listen to. But we'll give you a warning when they do come up, just in case you want to mute. We should also say a big thank you, shouldn't we?
Yes, to Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young. Some of their research this tour is based on, and so we thank them very much for that great work they've done there.
We should also say that we are monitoring YouTube, so if you're wanting to ask a question, please feel free to add it to the comments, and we'll be able to answer it directly live.
Hopefully.
So let's move
to our first stop. And so we are starting at Pukeahu National War Memorial Park here in Wellington. We're on the steps, and behind us you can see, virtually you can see the Carillon. Now that bell tower for the Carillon was dedicated on Anzac Day 1932, and there were huge crowds in attendance, as you can see from this image here. Now Pukeahu National War Memorial Park itself was completed for Anzac Day 2015, and it commemorates the 30,000 New Zealanders who've died, and the more than 300,000 who've served the country in various conflicts over time. Now, of those who serve overseas, many come back wounded, if they come back at all, wounded or terribly scarred. And that brings us to our first our first individual on this tour, Harold Gillies, a New Zealander who pioneered plastic surgery and also pioneered gender reassignment surgery.
So Harold was born in 1882 in Dunedin, and he left to study surgery, went to the UK in the early 1900s, and then in 1914, when World War I broke out, he joined up as part of the medical corps. So one of the biggest things that caused casualties and deaths in World War I was shrapnel. So we're talking about kind of little tiny metal pellets that are encased in a larger shell, and so when the shell explodes, all the bits of metal pepper out, and they can cause horrific injuries. So having limbs torn off, or a lot of kind of peppering of bodies as well. And so when Harold saw that, he put forward an idea of having a field hospital actually on the front line that would help in fixing or healing some of those horrific wounds. So he and a team set up a field hospital, and in the Battle of the Somme they did over 2,000 operations on service people. It was described as, quote, a stream of wounded men with half their faces literally blown to pieces, with the skin left hanging in shreds and jawbones crushed to a pulp. So Harold and his team really started investigating and using both the using bone from different parts of the body to re-establish structure, particularly in faces, and particularly taking it from the ribs, and also skin flaps, so growing skin on another part of the body and then transferring that onto the face. Those techniques become the basis of what we would say today is plastic surgery, and they really were kind of perfected because they had so many people to work on during World War One. After World War One, after doing, I think they did around about 11,000 operations in World War One, him and his team kept on going. They could see the real positive benefits, the psychological benefits for this kind of reconstructive surgery, and that kind of then flowed into thinking about gender affirmation surgery. And Harold and a teammate did one of the first male to female surgeries in the mid-1940s, and then 5 years later did a male to female surgery. Those processes, those procedures were then kind of implemented for the next 50 years. And so really he is one of the key people for doing gender reassignment, gender affirming surgeries. And he came from New Zealand. And I'll just see if I can blow up the image just a wee bit more. This is him here.
Well, while we're here at the War Memorial, we should look at another commemoration that happened on the steps here, just by where the tomb of the unknown warrior is. And this was a commemoration happening in the mid-1980s. It was May 1985, and Jeff Clements and Bill Logan were trying to have the persecution of lesbians and gay men recognised in the 40th anniversary of the end of the Holocaust, a Jewish commemoration event that was to be held at the Michael Fowler Centre. Now, at the same time, rainbow communities were protesting the inclusion at the event of the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army had been very vocal in their opposition to homosexual law reform, which was happening in the mid-1980s, and the exclusion of rainbow communities from that commemoration. So Bill Logan and Alison Laurie tried to organise an event here at the Hall of Memories under the Carillon. Now that too was denied, so people gathered out front on the steps here on the evening of the 6th of May 1985. And there were people like Bill and Alison, Prue Hyman, and the writer Tom McLean who described the scene with these words. Around us, just outside the circle created by our portable lights, I could sense them building. The bundles of bone, clad in lice-ridden rags, bald, reduced to a number tattooed on their wrists. And there was nothing to fear. They looked up at what was an all too familiar sight in a strange surrounding, a large cloth pink triangle illuminated from behind. It was the badge they had to wear in the camps to identify them as homosexuals. As the atmosphere deepened, so came the spirit of the women, lesbians, who in the camps had been denied even a label identifying why they'd been rounded up and imprisoned. For many, the average life expectancy in the camps was about half an hour, from the cattle trucks to the changing rooms, from the gas chambers to the ovens. Well, last of all came the men and women who'd borne the brunt of the Nazi hunt for a surgical cure for homosexuality and lesbianism. So we were huddled together, the living and the dead, and we saw the miracle, a survivor, someone who'd been through the hell that was Auschwitz and Mauthausen and come out alive. Well, that survivor that Tom McLean is talking about is Dr. Edith Egger. She was brought to New Zealand to be guest speaker at the commemoration at the Michael Fowler Centre, but she also attended this event, and she'd been found on top of a pile of rotting corpses in a concentration camp weighing only 27 kilograms. Well, 10 years later, in 1995, lesbians, gay men and disabled people were specifically invited to the 50th anniversary commemoration.
We'll just blow up the image just a wee bit further, and just to point out a few people. So this image is taken by David Henley, who was photographing a lot of homosexual law events around 85, 86. So we've got Prue Hyman just standing underneath the triangle, and next to Prue is Bill Logan. And then the second person sitting down, so not the first person, but the second person sitting down, that is Dr. Egger.
Dr. Egger, yeah. And she's still alive?
There's there's a fantastic interview on Radio New Zealand with her, which is very worth listening to. We're going to go to our next stop now, and our next stop is actually just on Tory Street. So Tory Street is just off Pukeahu Park, and the building that we're looking at behind us here, over there, is part of Te Papa, the New Zealand Museum, the National Museum, and the main museum is actually down on the waterfront. And this facility here is more of a research and store location for Te Papa. It's a massive building. Within this building we have lots of rainbow taonga, including the New Zealand AIDS Memorial quilt, all of the panels, pretty much all of the panels. We also have quite a lot of taonga from Carmen Rupe, who we'll talk about Carmen a bit later on today, and also the Evergreen Coffee Lounge's wall panels, and they again, we'll talk about today. They're from Chrissy Wituku. But there are also some other really fabulous things within Te Papa, including this this shirt here.
So this is a playing shirt from the Amazons, the first lesbian softball club in New Zealand. And they formed in Wellington at the height of gay liberation in 1977. The club provided a really important opportunity for self-identified lesbians to socialise, find solidarity and develop confidence in their sporting abilities. And the name the Amazons comes from the mythological Greek all-female warriors. Now, it wasn't easy for the Amazons at the beginning of their sporting career, with some of the other women's teams refusing to play against them. But over time they came to be accepted as a real force to be reckoned with. And a high point for them was when they were promoted to the major reserve during the 1988-1989 season.
Well, there are two Brians related to rainbow communities that are in Te Papa. One of them is Brian Tamaki, and at the time Brian was just Brian Tamaki, leader of Destiny Church, has since gone on to become self-appointed Bishop Brian Tamaki, and I think is now Apostle Brian Tamaki.
What's next? I wonder. Where do you go from there?
There's only one step up, or a couple of steps up, yeah. So in 2004, Destiny Church led a Enough is Enough rally and march in Wellington. It was against a number of things, but one of the main things they were against were civil unions, which were going through Parliament at the time. And so there was a big rally on the steps of Parliament. Brian wore a very simple polyester black and white suit, and that suit is now in Parliament. No, it's not in Parliament. It's in the museum, confined for posterity. And the other Brian that we're going to be talking about is Brian Brake. And here's a photo of Brian. If I can just bring this up. Lovely photo. So this is Brian as a camera person for the National Film Unit. And Brian was born in 1927 here in Wellington, and he studied photography with Spencer Digby, who was a very famous, well-known photographer and a photographic studio here in Wellington. Studied with him in 1945 and then moved on to the National Film Unit. And in fact, Brian was the first New Zealander to be nominated for an Academy Award for cinematography, which is, he didn't quite win, but he was the first nominated. Then Brian went on to do photojournalism, and in the 1950s and 60s he was particularly active around the world, particularly in China and Asia, and he did a lot of work in Egypt and Europe as well. Well, actually, I mean, like he was all over. I think he did like about 50 or so countries. He was very active. One of his best known photo series is the Monsoon series, and there's a photo here that is very well known of the monsoon. So during his career he was really careful to keep control of his negatives and transparencies and copyright, and so when he died, a lot of his collection, most of his collection, actually was acquired by the Museum Te Papa. And so in the museum there's around about 118,000 images, which is a huge amount, given that these aren't just kind of like snaps, these are, you know, professional photographs. So it's an amazing collection, and we're very lucky as a nation to have that in the National Museum. Brian kept working until his death in August 1988. Well,
Te Papa also has items relating to Frankie Lund and Johnny Croskery. Now, they performed together as female impersonators in the cabaret act Frankie and Johnny at Carmen's Balcony strip club on Victoria Street in the 1970s.
And we should point out in this photograph that Frankie's on the left and Johnny's on the right.
In a 2004 interview, Frankie explained that his family was very supportive of his drag performances and often joined in. Now, Frankie made most of his own outfits, and he had a huge selection of beads and buttons and feathers and trimmings and all sorts of things, costume jewellery. And Te Papa has a number of these garments in its collection. This is one of them here. It's quite amazing. Now, Frankie's drag persona was Tony Roger, who you can see there on the right of this image. And on the left is Johnny. Now, Johnny began his working life in the late 1950s as a window dresser for the DIC department store in Wellington. He was active as a performer from the 1960s, and he also worked quietly and tirelessly as a volunteer with the HIV/AIDS communities in Wellington. He did one-on-one support, but he could also be seen regularly collecting donations on World AIDS Day in the Manners Mall, Lambton Quay areas, and he would often farewell people by his signature farewell, "Have a gay day."
He wouldn't say it as quietly.
No, he wouldn't. He would shout it across the road. Yeah. And shortly we'll be stopping by the site of Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, where Johnny also performed. But first,
we're going to move a bit further down Tory Street, and we're actually going to the corner of Tory and Vivian Street. And here we have this building, which we'll just move out of the way. And that is the site of Club 41. And Club 41 was on the ground floor of this building, and it was the first lesbian club to be established here in Wellington in 1973. It was actually established by 4 women who actually purchased the lease off Carmen Rupe. So Carmen had an establishment here called the Peacock, and the 4 women put in $1,000 each. One of those women was Pauline Simmons, who we'll talk about very soon. They established this site in 1973. One of the things with this site was, with the club, was that there were quite restrictive licensing laws around liquor in New Zealand at the time. And so how they would get around that was basically you would buy a membership and then exchange your tokens for a drink. So there was no money changing hands for the drink itself. And this is just one of many clubs that were actually doing that similar kind of workaround. There's an image here we'll bring up of an advert for Club 41, and it was actually taken from the Circle magazine, and we'll talk about the Circle in just a minute, but the advert says at the top, "I couldn't cope in the straight world to save my life," and then right at the very bottom, "It's as if I've taken off a mask, I'm having such a wonderful time." And so this appeared in, I think it was December 1973. We'll come back to the Circle in a minute, but I'll just mention that initially Club 41 was a women's only club, and then it soon became a lesbian only club. And Alison Laurie noted in an interview a few years ago that at the time in the 70s, straight men had a real fascination with lesbians, and she would say, she said in the interview that, you know, like there would always be straight guys hanging outside saying to the women, "Oh, come and meet my wife," or you know, they were really turned on by it, which would have been really annoying actually.
Pretty gross, really.
You just want to go to a club. The Circle magazine that we're seeing here is actually printed by Her Story Press, and Pauline Simmons was the printer there. And there's actually a image here of Her Story Press, which is on Willow Street. So it was on the bottom part of this building here we can see in the image. Pauline was a remarkable activist who died in 2014. But like many, it happens often where it's just 1 or 2 key individuals that have got connections to wide amount of groups in the community and people as well. So Pauline was obviously a founder of Club 41, but was also part of Lilac, the Lesbian Lending Library, was part of SHE, the Sisters for Homophile Equality, which campaigned for homosexual law reform, was part of Gay Task Force, was part of the Amazon Softball Club, established a women's only bookstore in Upper Cuba Street in the 80s, and was a real powerhouse. And it's really lovely now to be able to talk about her and remember her as well.
Well, not far from where we are now, just a block down in fact, was the site of a murder of a gay man in Wellington.
And
so
we should say that this is one of the hate crime stories.
yeah, sorry, just
Yep.
to.
Yep.
Yep. So a block away from here is College Street, which you can see behind us now. And if we move apart,
If you want to move, do you want to move this way?
move this way. No,
Yeah.
no, no.
The building we're looking at is actually not there anymore, but it's where the white sign is, just behind Roger.
There we go. There we go. I hope you saw that. Number 18 College Street, in fact, is the address, and it was the site of the Adams Bruce chocolate factory. And on the 6th of February 1946, 50-year-old Miles Radcliffe, a manager at the factory, was found battered and strangled in a doorway. Now, the staff at the factory told the police that he was a homosexual. The caretaker said that he often took men back for long sessions in his office in the evenings, where he had a sofa. Now, Miles was found with serious head injuries. He hadn't been robbed, in fact, but the pathologist determined that he had been sexually aroused at the time of death. So police inquiries drew a blank and the killer was never found. And one historian writes, in the long history of New Zealand murders, none has proved so baffling. The motive was non-existent. But perhaps the motive for this crime could perhaps have been what's called homosexual panic, whereby a person finds a sexual advance from a member of the same sex offensive and frightening, and it brings about a psychotic state characterized by unusual violence. This is the so-called gay panic defense, and it's been used successfully in the past by a number of killers of gay men in New Zealand, meaning that ultimately, if they get convicted at all, it's for manslaughter rather than murder. Now, in 2004, the late Peter Wells wrote an article for The Listener about the trial of Philip Edwards, who killed David McNee in Auckland. Now, the article makes the point that, quote, it is impossible in New Zealand and many other countries to murder a homosexual. It is possible to be found guilty of manslaughter, but the underlying message is that any homosexual's life is of little value. And kind of really, scarily and disappointingly, it was only in 2009, so just over 10 years ago, that Parliament voted to remove the provocation defence from the Crimes Act. Now, this was in part due to a public outcry when provocation was used in a heterosexual context by Clayton Weatherston. Now, you might remember the crime. He claimed he was provoked into stabbing his ex-girlfriend 216 times. He was eventually convicted of her murder.
We're going to move to a bit of a happier subject now, and we're going to Vivian Street. And I'll just show you what it used to look like. This is actually Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, and it was a two-storey wooden building, and that's what it looked like in the 1970s. What it looks like now, I'll just bring up our background, is this. So I will part myself this way. The actual building itself is the darker building just on the far right. The reason why we've filmed it like this is because actually it's kind of entwined with the building in the centre, which is actually the Salvation Army Citadel. So for ever since the Carmen's was there, it was neighbours with the Salvation Army. And in fact, I think somebody told me recently that Carmen rented the site from the Salvation Army, so that's quite an interesting little tidbit. But Carmen was amazing. So Carmen Rupe was an entrepreneur. She had multiple businesses around Wellington in the 70s and early 80s, including she had a curio shop in Upper Cuba Street. She had the International Coffee Lounge here on Vivian Street. She had Le Balcon, the balcony, which was a nightclub on Victoria Street. She had a brothel in Haitaitai, and she had a couple of other little shops, like there was an Egyptian coffee shop on Cuba Street as well. She was just a bit of a powerhouse in terms of entrepreneurshipness things. She was also a real advocate for and an activist for things like homosexual law reform, for prostitution law reform, and also when HIV and AIDS came onto the scene, she very much was an activist around getting support for people and education. So Carmen was born in the North Island in 1936, in central North Island, and she moved to Auckland and then to Wellington, and then in the 50s she moved to Sydney's King's Cross. And at that time she was doing drag. It was called drag, and she became the first Maori drag queen in Australia. And actually from that time she self-identified as transsexual. In 1967 she returned to Wellington and started working around the Cuba Street, Vivian Street area, and this is where the Carmen's International Coffee Lounge came into play. It was a two-story building, so on the ground floor you had a coffee shop, and then on the upstairs there were rooms for sex work. So the opening hours were from 8 a.m. to 3 a.m, so it was open a long time. Menu was quite straightforward. Apparently it had the best toasty pies the best toasty sandwiches in Wellington. Drinks were kind of soft drinks, but they also did special laced coffee. So this is coffee laced with either rum or another kind of liqueur. And again, this was a way of getting around the very restrictive liquor licensing laws. Prostitution would take place upstairs, and so she kind of worked it by the coffee cup and saucer technique. I don't know if is it a technique?
It's a code.
So basically clients would have their drink and then they would let Carmen know what kind of liaison they would like. So for instance, a saucer on top of a cup was for a homosexual liaison. A saucer on the bottom of the cup was for a heterosexual liaison, and a cup on its side was for a transgender liaison. So Carmen would see this, would usher the client outside and then up the back stairs, and then a sex worker would meet them upstairs. And this is quite remarkable because it was so open, and given that prostitution law reform didn't happen until 2004, 2005, it's quite remarkable that it was actually quite kind of out there. Apparently Carmen had a wonderful quote, a wonderful saying for clients that were giving her a bit of stick. She would say to them, do you want a fuck or a fight? Because I can give you both. Later on we're going to meet, we're going to take you to the next location of Carmen's coffee shop. It was called the New International Coffee Lounge, and that's coming up.
Just very shortly, a little bit further up Vivian Street. But first we should just talk a little bit about the Salvation Army since we're here and on Vivian Street. If we jump forward a few years to March 1985, when MP Fran Wild was introducing the Homosexual Law Reform Bill into Parliament. Now, her bill set out to decriminalise homosexual activity between adult consenting males and to make it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their sexual orientation. So within a week of the introduction of the bill, a nationwide anti-law reform petition was launched by 4 MPs. And it was taken up by 2 businessmen, Peter Tate and the builder Keith Hay. Now at the time, Hay was quoted in the media as saying, "I'm just a carpenter doing God's work." But shortly after, the Salvation Army agreed to be the petition coordinator, and so they used their extensive network to circulate the petition far and wide. And in a letter to the Salvationists, Colonel Campbell of the Salvation Army wrote that many Christians and God-fearing people have embarked upon the gigantic task of endeavouring to secure a minimum of 1 million signatures on a petition to Parliament to prevent the passage of the bill. Now, in the Colonel's view, the moral decay of civilization was proceeding unchecked, and that it is in many ways a greater threat than that of nuclear destruction. So pretty bad. Very quickly, the anti-law reform petition was circulating nationwide, so it was being taken from house to house, door to door, being passed around workplaces and even in schools. And there's a great image here of a protest outside the Salvation Army in Vivian Street. So pro-reform campaigners got angry and they protested outside Salvation Army citadels around the country on the 31st of March 1985.
And isn't this wonderful that this protest is happening just next door to Carmen's?
So if you were there, you would have been able to hear various chants. 2, 4, 6, 8, gay is twice as good as straight. Door-to-door collection pays for door-to-door petition. And you might have heard the well-known hymn, Yes, Jesus Was Gay. And so there was an image there, sort of activists being right in the faces of Salvationists. But then there were those who were taking other actions. For example,
so this is B. Arthur and Betty Armstrong, and it's such a lovely photo. This is courtesy of the Arthur and Armstrong Trust. And so B and Betty had been together since 1943. And up until the point of law reform, they had been pretty private. I mean, they were very social, so they would go and do dances. They would go to the Victoria Club. They would have people over to their house. But this is probably one of the first kind of really political things that the pair did. They drove up and down Vivian Street honking their horn in support of homosexual law reform and against the Salvation Army. They met, as I say, in 1943, and a few years ago Alison Laurie interviewed B, who said right from the beginning the pair slept in the same bed, but at the time they didn't label their relationship as lesbian. B says, quote, "It didn't have a name. We didn't seem to feel the need to be called anything. We just were. It didn't seem to matter." Well, after Betty died in 2000, B established the Arthur and Armstrong Charitable Trust to really help kind of lesbian events and organisations around the Greater Wellington area. And the trust is named to recognise their 57-year relationship. So B herself passed away in 2002, and they're both buried together in Waikanae Cemetery, which is really lovely.
Yeah. Well, briefly back to the anti-reform petition. When it was presented to Parliament, the organisers claimed to have 800,000 signatures, but this was later discounted as there were lots of repeat signatures and forgeries. And we'll hear a bit more about the Salvation Army a little later on. But first, just moving a little further up Vivian Street to Carmen's new International Coffee Lounge.
And the locations we're actually talking about are between 140 and 144 Vivian Street, so we'll just part our ways. And so it's that whole kind of block with the subway, the green kind of apartment building is where 140 to 144 existed, and there are a number of locations we'll talk about. The first one being Carmen's new International Coffee Lounge, and so this is the second home for the Coffee Lounge, and it was here from the late 1970s. But Roger, I'll let you.
Oh,
this is Roger's part.
It's on my line. Yeah. So this was the second home of Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, and it moved here in 1979. As Gareth said, Carmen actually left Wellington soon after this, but the establishment fell into the hands of Chrissy Witoko, who took over ownership of the site in the early 1980s, and she opened the Evergreen Cafe here. Now,
I wouldn't quite say fell into the hands.
No,
of
it was a business transaction. Yeah.
Carmen and Chrissy were great friends, weren't they?
Yes,
Yep.
that's right. Yep. Chrissy's priority was always to ensure a gay and trans-friendly social environment, and it was a home away from home for many rainbow communities, and it was famous for its late-night toasted sandwiches, and Chrissy's warmth and remarkable ability to bring together people from very, very different backgrounds. Between 1986 and 1989, the Evergreen was an official gay and lesbian drop-in centre. It was run by volunteers and offered support and counselling, along with coffee and cake. And after 11 p.m, it became a drop-in centre for sex workers. Now, Chrissy operated the late-night coffee bar, The Nutcracker, again a little further up Vivian Street, just where the hole in the wall is now in Vivian Street. And following Chrissy's death in 2002, a group of her friends formed a trust to fundraise to help pay for funerals for those community members who weren't able to pay cover the costs of their own funerals. And in 2012, Te Papa took possession of, acquired a set of 34 collage panels created by Chrissy. And they used to hang around the walls of the Evergreen Cafe. And they feature Chrissy's friends, family and acquaintances. And they span from the 1960s through to 2002. And they're an important visual record of the people and places and major events that were intertwined with rainbow life in New Zealand at that time.
And just to get back to Frankie and Johnny, in one of those collages we've got Frankie on the left, Johnny on the right, and then we've got Carmen above.
Just above that, yeah. Now you can view these collages on the Te Papa website, and it's great because you can really zoom in and see all the details there of who's saying what about who to who.
So another business that was in this area between 140 and 144 Vivian Street was the Purple Onion, and here's a painting from the 1970s, an image of somebody painting in the 1970s. The Purple Onion was Wellington's first strip club, and it was opened in 1964, and I should actually say it's Wellington's first drag club, 1964, opened by Pasi Tunapopo, and Pasi had been in Australia and was the first Samoan to dance at Les Girls and the Purple Onion in Sydney, and so the Purple Onion was really renowned for all male reviews. And there's a lovely photo here from 1965. This is the Salient magazine, the Victoria University student magazine, and this is a review that was happening in 1965.
Well, we'll just move on a bit to talk about some other examples of female impersonators.
That's right.
Our next stop.
And our next stop is actually a couple of minutes walk away, but through the magic of the internet, we're already
right
here. And what we're actually looking at, and what we'll come back to, is the 22 Wigan Street. And, I don't think it's the same building, but the location is the same. And so before we talk about 22 Wigan Street, we'll just talk a bit more about female impersonation and the history in New Zealand, because there is a long and rich history of female impersonators in New Zealand. We can step back right to, say, World War II, where we had the Kiwi Concert Party. And the Kiwi Concert Party had performers like Bill Bain as Carmen Miranda, and also we have Ralph Dyer as Marlene Heatrash, which I'll just bring up here. And Marlene was performing in New Caledonia in 1943. So the Kiwi Concert Party came about when General Freiberg was in Egypt, and he saw a performance, and he raced backstage. At that time it wasn't a full-time gig. He raced backstage and said, "We need this for the troops. We need to entertain them." And so from that moment, the Kiwi Concert Party was formed, and it spent half its time doing military service, so like training for killing people, and then the other half it was spent entertaining the troops, and they would go as close to the front line as possible and entertain the Allied troops. As I say, here's Ralph. Now, Ralph was with the concert party for a good many years. After the war in World War II, so we're talking, 1945, the Kiwi Concert Party toured New Zealand for another 10 years before Ralph then moved into cabaret in Auckland.
But we can go back even further into New Zealand history to find examples of female impersonators. Here's an image taken about 1887, and it shows the performer and photographer Robert Gant on the right there. Now, Robert lives most of his life in Wairarapa in Wellington, and he has a long career as a female impersonator using the stage name Cecil Riverton. Now, the Evening Post declared Cecil as achieving a pronounced success in the part of Little Buttercup in the 1881 production of HMS Pinafore. Now, Robert's extraordinary life and photographs have been documented in Chris Brickell's book from 2012, manly affections. Certainly worth having a look at.
Well, just back to 22 Wigan Street, and 22 Wigan Street was the site of another lesbian club which was formed in 1984, and this time it was a real focal point for a lot of events, but also around homosexual law reform. There was a conference that was held here, and then in 1987 we had the very famous Audre Lorde, the US poet, visit and presented at this particular event. Location, I should say, and this is a photo of Audre. So Audre is regarded internationally as one of the most important writers of the Black feminist movement. Has really dedicated her life to addressing injustices, sexism, homophobia, racism. Has been very, very big internationally. One of Lorde's famous quotes is, "Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It's a learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." During Jan Logie's maiden speech in Parliament a few years ago now, she revealed that she has a tattoo of some words from Audre Lorde, and that tattoo reads, "My silences have not protected me." Really strong words, very strong words.
Yep.
We're going now to Cuba Street, which is just around the corner from Wigan Street, and I will just turn our background into this, and what we're looking at is the People's Palace, which is this wonderful 4-story building behind us, and that was actually owned by the Salvation Army.
And where we're standing nominally, where this is filmed from, is just outside the front of the Salvation Army national headquarters, which was opened by the territorial headquarters opened by Princess Anne in 1990. Lovely. Now the Army has 100 communities of faith throughout New Zealand, Fiji and Tonga, and has around 500 officers and 8,000 members. So we know that the Salvation Army was very much against homosexual law reform. How do you think they did when it came to civil unions in 2004? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because the church was divided and certainly a lot less publicly vocal in its opposition. That role was taken up by Destiny Church. And in the Salvation Army's submission to the Parliamentary Select Committee, they said that they accepted the arguments for the Relationships Act, which removed discrimination against homosexual partners, but they urged upon Parliament the importance of supporting and valuing marriage as foundational to society. And by marriage, they meant one man married to one woman. There was, however, a small Salvationist protest at Parliament, and media reports noted that 6 representatives of the Army turned up outside Parliament with a banner reading, "Yeah, civil union, now I can marry my goat and have children." And they dragged a live goat along with them, which caused swift and just criticism from animal rights activists. So there.
Well, just going back to the People's Palace, and the People's Palace, there have been a number of People's Palaces built by the Salvation Army, both in New Zealand and Australia, but this is the only one that survives. And they were built by the Salvation Army to assist people with low rent. It didn't cost a lot to stay there, and it was also alcohol free, so very good for travellers, for families, for people with low incomes. This site has been built up over a number of years, so the original People's Palace was a lot smaller. And even before that, there was another Salvation Army building there called the Paulina Rescue Home. And if we'd stayed there in the mid-1890s, we would have come across a Eugene Fellini, and this is a police photo of Eugene. And I think both Eugene and the next person we'll talk about are really good examples of perhaps what we would say are non-binary lives now.
Yeah. So Eugene was born in Italy in 1875 and came to New Zealand at the age of 2 with his family. Now, he was the eldest of 22 children, 17 of whom survived. Eugene was working at Murphy's Brickworks in Taranaki Street when he was taken to court for impersonating a man. Around 1895, he ran away to sea, aged 21. Eugene was raped multiple times by the ship's captain and had a baby in Sydney in 1898. Staying in Sydney and changing his name to Harry Crawford, he married twice and was charged and subsequently convicted of murdering one of those wives in 1920. Now, the evidence for the murder conviction is pretty circumstantial and by today's standards is far from compelling, but nevertheless he was convicted and imprisoned. And Eugene sadly died in 1938 after being released from prison and stepping off the pavement and accidentally into the path of an oncoming car.
Now, we think that Eugene may be buried in Australia, but we certainly know that Eugene's parents are buried here in Wellington in Karori Cemetery. And here's just a image. So their grave is the white grave on the left-hand side. It's around about a 10-minute walk from the entrance to Karori Cemetery, and still a very large Fellini family here in Wellington. I think, Roger, you were saying, 17 children survived.
Yeah, huge family.
Yeah. Well, the other person we'll talk about at this point, at this stop, is Amy Bock. And again, Amy is somebody that nowadays you might refer to as non-binary. And this is a photo of Amy, or a couple of photos of Amy. So Amy was born in Tasmania and immigrated to New Zealand in 1884, and really had a long history of run-ins with the justice system here in New Zealand. A lot of the times for fraud. So Amy would kind of buy things without on credit and not have any money. Or order things and have them delivered without having any money, which ended up in jail time. She spent 3 years in jail in 1887, came out of jail, and then actually went to live with the Salvation Army in Timaru. And unfortunately, she continued to have run-ins with the law. Probably the most well-known case for Amy was when she took on the name Percy Ridgewood, and Percy actually married Agnes Ottaway in 1908, and there was a big wedding, and Percy was portrayed as a very wealthy farmer from Canterbury. Unfortunately, 3 or 4 days after the wedding, Agnes Ottaway wanted the wedding annulled, citing that Percy was not actually Percy. And so Amy was taken to court and charged and convicted for false pretenses for masquerading as a man. And so that certainly made national headlines, and even things like postcards were produced showing Percy and Amy, and it was pretty dark. Unfortunately, Amy continued having trouble with the justice system here in New Zealand, and pretty much for the majority of her life. Nowadays, some people would kind of say that Amy was potentially non-binary, a trans man, or a lesbian, but author Fiona Farrell put it another way. She came up with another idea, saying, had Amy lived in Europe, she may well have come to the attention of psychologists who were studying a number of similar cases in which young working class women attempted to escape their proper, in quotation marks, roles as housemaids, cooks and governesses by disguise and petty fraud. I think we can safely say that both Amy and Eugene had really tough lives, and I think a lot of that was just in how society kind of dealt with people. Yeah.
Well, on to our next stop now, and just a quick trigger warning, really. This is involving another murder. So early in the morning of the 8th of May 1999, 14-year-old Jeff Whittington was sitting here on the curb of this petrol station. He'd had a night out, he was drunk and he was high. At 4:20 a.m, a police officer walks past and asks him how he is. He says he's okay, and so the police officer leaves. Also out drinking that night are two men in their mid-20s, Stephen Smith and Jason Meads, and quite by chance they drive past Jeff here at the petrol station. Now he's a complete stranger to them. They stop their car and they start talking to Jeff, and all three eventually wind up a short drive away in Arrow Valley to smoke a joint, and here's the location of where they got to.
And I think they found Jeff just beyond that red house. Yeah.
So it was here that Stephen and Jason beat Jeff to death. Now the pair boasted to acquaintances that they'd beaten up a faggot who'd been wearing makeup. They told their acquaintances that they'd never seen anyone bleed from the places that he bled from. Stephen and Jason admitted to punching and kicking him, but they denied stomping on his head, and they said that they never meant to kill him. Jeff suffers severe brain damage, has boot marks on his skin, and suffers a ruptured bowel. A woman finds him alone, lying in a puddle at 4:40 a.m, and he dies in hospital the next day. So the jury convicts both Stephen and Jason of murder, and they are sentenced to life imprisonment. Jason is released from prison in 2013, and Stephen is freed on parole in April 2017, and he's been released on 3 previous occasions and recalled to prison each time. Now Jeff would have been in his mid-30s had he was still alive.
Well, the death of Jeff, the murder of Jeff, moved a lot of people, and in particular because it happened very shortly after Matthew Shepard was killed in a hate crime in Wyoming in the USA, and so you had these two very prominent graphic killings that really affected a lot of people. One person that it affected was Ronald Trefero Nelson, who was a local playwright, and in the 2000s he wrote a play called 4 a.m. in Cuba, which detailed what happened to Jeff Whittington. And the play premiered at Bats Theatre here in Wellington in 2007. And I don't know if you've never been to Bats, it's quite a small theatre, it sits around about 100 people. And Ronald was telling us a few years ago now that on opening night they had both Jeff's family and also the perpetrator's family in the audience at the time, and just what an extreme night that would have been.
Tense.
Absolutely tense. Yeah. But again, really lovely to be able to remember Jeff today. We're going to head to our last stop now, and that is just up on Willis Street, and it's this wonderful church, St. Peter's on Willis Street.
And much more uplifting. So on this tour we've covered the Salvation Army's response to homosexual law reform and civil unions. In 2012, the Army joined together with Rainbow Wellington to issue a statement relating to homosexual law reform and its effects, and each statement was endorsed by both groups. And here are a couple of excerpts from the Salvation Army statement. Since the events of law reform in 1986, the Salvation Army has reflected deeply on its actions and the hurtful way some members publicly expressed their view on this legislative change. We regret and apologise for any hurt that may remain from that turbulent time. Our present hope is to rebuild bridges of understanding and dialogue between our movement and the LGBTI community. We may not agree in the future on all issues, but we can respect and care for one another despite this. Well, the statement had a very mixed reception, with one veteran activist saying that the Salvation Army needed to show some accountability for the gay lives that were lost to suicide during that time. And I guess we should ask the question, how do you think the Salvation Army went on marriage equality? We know how they went on civil unions and homosexual law reform. Well, when it came to the marriage equality bill, in 2013, the Army made a submission to the Select Committee. They said that they opposed the bill, but their submission only covered the need for reassurance that their marriage celebrants wouldn't be forced to marry same-sex couples.
And we should also say, just bringing it up to very recent times, because I mean 2013 was a little while ago, the Salvation Army came out in support of banning conversion practices, conversion therapy. They were very clear in their submission that they thought it was wrong, and it was such a big change from where they were in the mid-80s, and certainly I think should be applauded.
Yep, credit where it's due. Yep. So here we are at St Peter's Anglican Church. Now the Anglican Church still has some way to go to fully accepting marriage equality. In May 2018, the church voted in favour of allowing priests to bless same-sex marriages or civil unions, but not to carry out same-sex marriage within the Anglican Church.
But some parishes are a lot more progressive, and one of those parishes is behind us here, St Peter's. And in 1967, and the reason we're standing here virtually is that in 1967 the Reverend Godfrey Wilson did an amazing sermon that was broadcast nationally on national radio, and it really called for the tolerance towards homosexuals. And just to give you a bit of a kind of a context, so 1967 is at least 20 years before homosexual law reform happened, and this is a great example of what some of the attitudes were like. This is a newspaper story where we've got a detective, a law enforcement person, F.A. Gordon, if you like acronyms, that's FAG, is asking people in Christchurch, do we want our cities overrun with pimps, ponces, pansies, pussyfoots, and perverts?
Yes.
It might be the call, yes. But so that's the kind of climate that Godfrey Wilson was in. And basically he said, well, actually, no, we need to be a lot more tolerant. And so the sermon was about John, and John was in prison and was being talked to by a chaplain. And John said to the chaplain, if you fall in love and marry, that's fine, but if I fall in love and want to share it, that's perversion and must be persecuted and punished. Well, in 2017, this same sermon was given to mark the 50th anniversary of this really historic moment in kind of church history. And this time it was led by Reverend Annette Cater. And Annette was also blessing the rainbow banners around the church, and we can see here that this is just some of the banners that were there. These banners were actually made out of clergy vestments. I think Annette's mum was a vestment maker, and so she took some of that material and made these wonderful banners and flags. And Annette's blessing was, quote, we know that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in it. And God said it is good, all of it. And so, in that spirit, may these banners be a symbol of that all-encompassing, generous, amazing, unending love for all, that all who see it may be overwhelmed by the power of that love and know, God, that you are a God of love.
Well, on that particularly optimistic and positive note, we end this tour.
Yes, we really hope you've enjoyed today's tour. We're really looking forward to starting back up doing the physical walk tours with the COVID situation getting better now here in New Zealand. We're going to start looking at doing some physical walking tours. We need the physical side of things. But we'll also try and keep doing some virtual ones as well. Thanks again to Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young for their research. Very much appreciated.
And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
And we really look forward to seeing you again. Ka kite.
Ka kite. Bye.